To make the ambient sounds of space gophers in Halo, Foley artists actually recorded these alien-like noises made by a couple of playful pugs. That's just one of the many surprising ways sounds are made for TV, movies, and video games. And the trick is often finding the perfect object to create as realistic a sound as possible, like this tree stump. What you see and hear is a tree stump wrapped in leather. Foley artist Marco Costanzo of C5 Sound thought of this innovative combination when he had to make the noises for Manny the Mammoth in Ice Age. It helped capture the sound of a massive creature stomping on the ground. Marco needed to make sure he got an object that accurately captured not only this creature's weight, but also the pattern in which a creature of this size would walk, in this case, heel to toe. Foley artists use objects to create sounds based on a character's movements and interactions.
We have to make sounds that embellish their movements.
Marco's done Foley sounds for movies like Goodfellas, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and The Big Lebowski. But mimicking the sounds of animals isn't as easy as woofing or purring. Though he can do that too. Picking the right sounds involves carefully examining both objects and surfaces. Take horses galloping, for instance. A pair of plastic coconut shells could certainly do the trick, but when it came time to make the horse sounds for a movie like 2010's True Grit remake,
I use rocks because you can hear the sound of the impact. When you're using coconuts, yeah, you might hear that little click. But when I use a rock, I hear boom, 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 boom. If you ever hear and ride a horse, you're hearing that 2,000, 5,000 pound animal on every footstep going boom, 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 boom.
While the plastic shells might work on cobblestones, Marco realized you can barely hear them in dirt, the surface the horses in True Grit were most likely to tread upon.
I'm not going to use the typical coconuts because there's no weight and you don't really even hear that cavity sound. These would be the medium size. Immediately you can hear a little bit more of the bottom end, right? And my favorite are the rocks. You're getting a low end thud right along with your crunchy.
An animal's size is a big factor, especially when that animal is tiny. Marco did the sounds for the dragonfly in the opening of 1997's Men in Black.
We were really playing with different kinds of paper and cards. I remember one of the ideas was, well, put a card in a bicycle spoke and spin it, and you hear the and everyone's like, yeah, great, but you hear the metal spoke. Well, and then the question was, well, how do we do that and not get it sound like metal? How do you get it sound organic like an animal?
Marco found the right sound using handheld fans. With the fans, Marco could more easily adjust the dragonfly's variation in movement by putting his finger on the blade. A different challenge arose when working on Marley and Me, which chronicles a dog's life from puppy to old age. Marco had to figure out how to make the dog sound different at different ages, so it wasn't just about size, but how an animal grows over time.
I have two different size nails on them. These are the smaller ones, and you can see there's bigger ones on that side. And they sound distinctively different. Listen to this one. These are the smaller ones. Now, I would flip these around. I'm not going to flip right now.
Here's a younger, more excited dog. And the same dog at a much older age. And for some scenes, Marco had to layer a track for the dog's collar. For a bigger dog, Marco used a heavy chain. And a smaller dog has a smaller collar, so you just hear the tags.
So every time they're moving their head, you think they're so cute. Oh yeah, but they're non-stop noise.
It's not just a one-sound-fits-all type of deal. For gigantic animals, like that mammoth from Ice Age, Marco had to create multiple sounds and then have them layered to truly capture the physical scope of the character.
When we went to do a second track, picked up a bunch of grass, and at the same time we rolled this.
Then he added some pebbles and twigs to capture things the mammoth might be stomping on. There are plenty of other considerations that go through the mind of a Foley artist when making animal sounds, like how many animals there are.
If I was doing a single bird and he was flying, I'd be like, in rhythm. Fast. Taking off. A flock of birds, I wouldn't even use feathers. I would probably use gloves for that.
When it comes to eating, Marco might need to think about whether the food is wet or dry, or whether the animal has a snout. For example, if it's a horse chewing celery.
I put my hands up to here because you get a little bit of a cavity there. And it's those cavities that sell the sound.
On some occasions, if a digital library won't do, he'll also have to do the vocals himself. To see a Foley artist's thought process about animal sounds in action, we put Marco to the test by showing him a stock video clip with no sound that he had never seen before.
Adorable. Oh boy, claws. This thing's... All right. That's definitely AstroTurf. You got a few tracks to do. Because you got the claw on the ground, you got the claw on the thing, you got the teeth on the mat, you got the body movement, the fur.
For the mat, Marco found one in his studio with very similar material.
We're going to do the paws first, and for paws we just need a pair of leather gloves.
For the lion's teeth, he used this small block of wood with nails drilled into it, which he created for the tiger in Life of Pi.
One more time. Got to work on sync.
He brought back the wood block for the cub's scratching.
The claws, which are very similar to the teeth, they have different action. They were pulling at it. Here it's gripping. I have a few different varieties of fur here. We've got the AstroTurf. The cat is moving along it, so we're going to rub his body along the bottom as he pulls himself forward. Bring the mic real close. It's a very small sound. That'll be the most convincing sound, because all of a sudden you go from just an animal that's there moving around to you have the feeling of it against the floor. You feel its presence.
To top it all off, a few collar shakes and a few chews.
With this little guy, I'm only opening my mouth and doing like maybe 50% of the volume I could get, you know. Right now he's got a little tongue lick that we're gonna get a little bit of a slobbering sound. Remember, cat also has a dry tongue. It might be a little sandpapery, but you know, when it's on itself, it's just a...
Then, a Foley mixer watched the footage and layered it all together. So, what makes watching this without sound, and then with sound, different?
The sounds that we make brings you into the personality of the animal. You become closer to it. You want to give it a personality, you want to give the sounds a personality, and you can do it by its sound movements. That's what Foley artists do. We give detail.
Oftentimes, the most common sounds are the most difficult to recreate, like footsteps.
Those high heel clicks you hear in the TV series Fargo, those are actually men's dress shoes.
These are actually probably my favorite pair of heels. I use these all the time.
And in another scene, you actually hear men's sneakers instead. The smallest changes can make the difference between a believable but pleasant sound and a harsh, abrasive one. And it's up to Foley artists to find just the right combo of footwear, surfaces, and rhythm to match the movements perfectly, making Footsteps Foley the hardest sounds to master. Being in sync with the action on screen is crucial for Foley artists, and footsteps can be especially tricky to match.
When you start to get into more complicated scenes, like running and scuffing and stopping, or fight scenes, going up and down stairs, that kind of thing, it takes a while to really be able to anticipate the actor's movements.
So to follow any small changes in movement, Stefan actually starts on one foot because it gives him more control.
That allows me to sort of anticipate and be very light with subtle movements to start a walk, and then I'll go into 2 feet, and then when I feel like they're beginning to slow down, I can switch back to 1 foot, and that helps anticipate the stopping moments.
This skill is especially helpful for scenes involving stairs.
There's a subtle difference between going upstairs and going downstairs. Up is more slidey. And then down is much more impacty, kind of flatter.
And not all footsteps are the same. Pacing can vary based on the size of the character. Take children, for example.
Adults will generally have like a heel-toe.
Meaning this pattern feels more natural.
Whereas kids are usually more flat-footed. And occasionally, if they're excited, very stompy.
Part of mastering the sync is distributing his body weight correctly. Like he had to do for the doll in the 2016 horror film The Boy. His footsteps needed to be extra light.
Trying to do it with my actual body weight was just not working. It was sounding too heavy.
So instead of standing up, he sat on the edge of a chair. That way he could stomp away while removing the weight from the rest of his body. Sometimes keeping up with the action doesn't even involve your feet, like when he does footsteps for animals.
I only have 2 hands, not 4, like a dog.
By using bean bags for the paws with buttons glued to them to stand in for nails, he can get the right pattern with just his 2 hands. When it comes to even smaller animals, he'll switch to just 1 hand. Dance scenes like this one from 2004's Being Julia can be more straightforward. But that wasn't the case when doing Foley for this tap dance routine from The Porter.
I'm not a tap dancer, so I tried doing it with my feet and it was too hard.
So he followed along and recreated the tap dancing sounds with real tap shoes, with his hands.
And normally I would never use my hands for doing footsteps because you don't have the same weight. Tap shoes are so hard and tappy that no matter what you do with them, the sound is just kind of always pretty similar.
The decision about whether to use his hands or his feet comes out of experimenting long before recording. For example, for this mascot in Jane the Virgin, boxing gloves replicated its big squishy feet.
I tried doing the footsteps with my hands and it just didn't have the right weight, so 99 times out of 100 it's better to do footsteps with your feet if you can. Just the movement feels more natural than trying to do it with your hands.
Even if Stefan uses the right footwear, the footsteps won't sound right unless he's stepping on the correct sounding surface. This isn't always straightforward, as not every type of dirt, grass, rocks, or snow sounds the same. He starts by choosing from a wide variety of mixtures in bags and laying them out on a hard and solid surface. Surfaces like sand wouldn't produce a noticeable enough sound on their own. This is when he'll mix in other elements like cat litter or bits of limestone.
I found that it just gives it a little more volume, a little more level, but it's the same consistency.
When it comes to rockier surfaces, the size of the rocks makes all the difference.
This gravel is not very big. It's kind of small to mid-sized. So if that's not what's happening in the scene, it's not going to work.
But there is some leeway for how his surface matches up with a scene, like when it comes to walking on grass.
We always order in fresh sod, but sometimes, honestly, fresh grass doesn't have that much level to it. There's like a happy spot between when it's completely fresh and completely dried out.
Wood is one of the most common surfaces for footsteps, but 2 floors in the same house can also sound different.
This is just like a traditional house wood floor that we use on a regular basis.
When moving up a level, a more weighted piece is ideal. For less weighty wooden surfaces like a dock or this patio, Stefan uses a thinner piece of wood. By placing it on top of thicker wood, the appropriate sound comes through.
Still has nice weight, but there's a hollowness to it as well, like you would see on a dock or on a porch, because there's really not a lot of weight underneath it.
Getting some of the best stepping sounds on surfaces also means using footwear you wouldn't expect. For instance, Stefan can use heels on a hard surface, but he'll often manipulate them with duct tape. This trick helps even out any of the heel's higher-end sounds. You can also get a more convincing heel sound with men's dress shoes. And on grass or dirt, heels won't come across the right way, as the heels will sink into the surface, leaving a lot of thud and little definition. And on gravel or rocks, the end result can be downright unpleasant. So in these cases, he will switch to a pair that are lighter and easier to control. Wearing the right footwear gets even trickier when a character steps from surface to surface in the same track.
The boots sound a little bit too heavy on this surface. It can get a bit too thuddy, so as the character moves from the sidewalk to the grass, I might actually switch to lighter shoes, even though they're obviously wearing the same footwear. Just because it sounds more natural.
And then there are other surface interactions that sound better with no shoes at all.
When I do creaks, I do them in socks, so there's actually no impact sound, but all you're getting is the creak itself.
Stefan also recorded a separate track of this while wearing shoes. This is a part of a process known as sound layering, which can improve any set of footsteps. By recording the footsteps and then the snow and ice separately here, the sound mixer can adjust and boost each sound. For the first layer, Stefan steps on a mixture of salt and kitty litter. Another layer can serve as what he calls a sweetener. In this case, some extra crunch is provided by manipulating a bag of cornstarch. Extra layers don't just help capture the proper surface, but can also make an ordinary movement funny or scary.
Oh my God, that's it.
Like squeaks on a wooden floor.
If you get a bit of water on the floor, and it takes a second to prep because it's gotta dry a little, like this.
Knowing the genre, tone, and context of a clip can take Foley footsteps from good to great. This could mean adding in the nervousness of a character in a horror film, or the joy from this character in being Julia.
It's not enough to have proper sync that matches the actor in the scene. It's not enough to have the actual sound that works. You also have to be aware of their motivation, what they're feeling in the scene, and make sure that your footsteps sound natural.
While footsteps might require the perfect pair of shoes, for realistic fight scenes, sometimes you just need to find the perfect cut of meat.
This is the classic first fight scene in Kill Bill Volume 1. Now, look at this scene again, but without sound. Foley sounds tend to go unnoticed, but you realize just how important they are when they're gone. Sean Brennan, a Foley artist for movies, TV, and video games, showed us what kinds of sounds can really make a fight scene pop. Foley sounds are created practically and based on a character's movements and interactions with the world. Naturally, they're a big part of fight scenes. Brennan has done Foley sounds for a variety of fight scenes. We met with him at Parabolic in New York.
It depends on what's going on in the scene. If it's a real quiet moment, I try to make it sound as natural as possible. But if you're in a fight and there's a lot of noise going on, I will go over the top.
Foley isn't used for every single sound in a fight scene. Certain sounds need to be created digitally, but there are a few crucial elements to every fight scene where the Foley artist's work is necessary.
With the hand-to-hand stuff, sometimes I'll go home covered in bruises.
For the most part, the sounds of hand-to-hand combat are made exactly as you'd expect.
So when doing punch sounds, I'll always do like a real natural sounding punch. Got that, or punch in the arm. Or sometimes then after that, I'll beef it up.
A pair of gloves can add some extra thud to a punch. These sounds can work on their own or be layered together, meaning just one single punch can contain 3 separate sounds, and in some cases, even more than that. We'll get to layering a bit later. Even a sound as simple as a punch can involve some thinking outside the box.
In this case, we have a flank steak. A piece of steak like this is just, it's very similar to like a human cheek, you know?
This helps create a fleshier punch effect, perfect for a face punch. Plus, it doesn't just sound like a character is simply punching their own hand. And of course, you can't have a fight without a few solid kicks. And who knows, maybe you'll even have to kick a door down. Just don't go into a fight empty-handed. Some of these sounds, like bullets flying through the air, which involve no human interaction, will be created separately by a sound editor. But somebody still has to handle a gun. Brennan often uses a door lock and puts it against a rifle. When it comes to weapons, using the real thing is typically the best option.
Well, here's some good-looking swords. But the problem is they're decorative, so there's a lot of plastic on here and they don't sound great. But any hits sounds cheap. So having something heavier, some metal stuff, sounds much better. You get these kind of sounds.
Usually, one Foley artist will make sound for both sides of a given fight. Using the real weapons creates the most realistic sounds. To get that iconic sound of swords whooshing in the air, Foley artists will typically use wooden dowels.
Not very realistic at all, but it sounds great in the film. It's still a human element, just, you've heard that before, say if a baseball flies by you or something.
The dowels also work well for kicking and flying through the air, but some of the most complex, eye-popping sounds don't have anything to do with weapons, but rather the injuries. When creating the Foley sounds for injuries, things can get a little messy. Food especially comes in handy here.
Celery is good, really good for bone cracks. So you break an arm, give it a nice little, gives it more impact.
And if you want to get a good stomp in there, then you'll have to step on a few apples. Meanwhile, other foods, like raw chicken and melon, can also give you good, fleshy sounds. Smashing a watermelon can give you an exploding head. And while not edible, a wet leather towel sounds just as gruesome. A lot of these sounds could end up being drowned out in the final cut. Yet some of the most important sounds Brennan must capture for a fight are the ones you would least expect, like the rustling of clothes.
So when the actor goes to punch, I just follow the arm.
This is yet another sound the audience is familiar with, and therefore one that can help bring them into the scene. These raw sounds are likely not the only thing you'll hear in the final product. There's an extensive process that follows in which sounds are edited and layered together. Combining all the different layers of the punch sound we heard earlier really brings it to life.
So here's just the regular punch, and then here's with the glove. You know, right now they're not really mixed together, but already you can start to feel it being heavier as far as the impact. Can get pretty gross.
So sure, your fight scene can have the coolest moves and feature the fiercest warriors, but it will be nothing without the right sound.
When it comes to fictional worlds and scenarios, a Foley artist needs to get creative. Like using a bunch of grapes to make the creepy clicking from an alien race.
A Quiet Place was one of the most unlikely hits of 2018. Made on a budget of just $17 million, the horror film would go on to gross more than $332 million worldwide. Emily Blunt earned praise for her performance, and actor John Krasinski had his first major breakthrough as a director. One thing that makes the movie so unique? Its use of sound. A Quiet Place is set in a post-apocalyptic world overrun with monsters with ultra-sensitive hearing. Make a single sound, and you're in big trouble. Therefore, the characters communicate in sign language and make the lightest of footsteps. While the movie has a groundbreaking lack of sound, that doesn't mean it's completely absent of it. Brandon Jones, Ethan Van Der Rijn, and Eric Adol of E² are responsible for much of what you hear on screen.
Sound was actually written into the script. And so for us, it was like a dream come true, like kids in a candy store.
Here's how some of the movie's most notable sounds were made. Foley, a method in which objects are used to create sounds made by humans, or in this case, monsters, was used.
A Foley stage is a super quiet environment where we can put picture up on the screen and then record using our microphones in sync with the picture.
Some sounds, like a shotgun loading and water splashing, were made exactly as you'd expect. For other sounds, they had to get creative. The most unusual sound might be the echolocation sounds used to illustrate how the monsters get around without vision. To make this sound, they settled on putting a stun gun up to a patch of grapes. They then manipulated the sound in the next phase, the editing process.
The whole concept with these creatures is there's kind of an electromagnetic component. So using something electrical as a source for the vocals seemed to kind of make sense. So here's our recording of the stun gun. And we can take that sound and slow it down, and we can hear the individual electric clicks.
Not every sound effect requires Foley. For the sound of a baby crying, Brandon Jones recorded the sound of his baby nephew crying. One of the biggest challenges of this movie wasn't what you heard with ease, but the kind of sounds we might normally tune out. Footsteps are a classic Foley noise any sound designer is used to making. Usually, it'll be loud. But for A Quiet Place, the team had to account for the fact that the characters mostly walked around barefoot.
Where we would play Foley footsteps, where not to, were really dictated by the logic of the film. On a lot of Y shots, we didn't even shoot the Foley for those feet. If we can hear it from such a distance, the creatures can too. And then when you cut into an extreme close-up and you see a foot push through sand, then we hear it just chiaroscuro.
The scariest sound of all, though, the lack of sound.
It's rare that you get to work on a movie that has this much absolute silence and parts where music and dialogue's all stripped away and it's just these faint details. One of the biggest things that happened throughout the course of post-production for this movie was really scaling back and being more minimalist in the creature sound design, because our first pass had him making noise all over the place, and we kept scaling back and making it kind of a less is more approach.
Following in the path of one of the great monster movies before it, Jaws, the less we see, or in this case, the less we hear from the monsters, the more terrifying they are. And yet, good luck getting that stun gun sound out of your head now.
Video games have become much more cinematic over the years. They too require a skilled Foley artist, and occasionally a friendly pug.
These are Buddy and Gyoza, and their sniffles and grunts aren't being recorded for a kids' movie. They're actually being used for ambient sounds in the game Halo. These snorts are just some of the many sounds captured to give players immediate sonic feedback for every possible action, like firing a weapon, driving a tank, or even taking a footstep into a new environment.
I think the biggest advantage film has, they know what is going to come next. We never do.
So on the latest release of the game, Halo Infinite, sound designers had to create highly unique, game-specific sounds to be delivered in countless variations to the player.
It's important from a style perspective, but it's also just important from a gameplay perspective that players are able to identify sounds by whatever their sound characteristics are.
One of the most important pieces of feedback in Halo, a first-person shooter game, is this. The sound of the weapons.
Whenever we design a weapon, we kind of always break it down into components. The punch is kind of a low frequency.
That low-end thud is what gives the sound force and power.
We'll have the mechanical layer. Your mechanical stuff is like the high-frequency stuff.
The mechanical part of the sound can be the most tactile and satisfying for the player. Think thick clanks of metal. Or some of these sounds the team got out of Xbox hardware. The tail is the sound of the gunshot bouncing off the environment. The qualities of this sound give a sense of where the gun's being fired, whether a narrow interior or an open field. The variations with these tail recordings are part of adaptive sound design, which tailors sounds to specific environments.
Like the player can do anything at any given moment. So you have to take those considerations deeply when you're designing your material so that it can work in any of those types of situations that the player might encounter.
And the sound also gives players feedback about their actions, like when they fire.
I think that's part of communication to the player too, like that
Definitely.
Mechanical sound actually ramps up as you run out of ammo to tell the player that they need to reload in a battle.
And if the player tries to fire when they've run out of ammo, these very mechanical typewriter sounds signify that it's dry fire. On top of all that, the designers add layers of sci-fi sounds to create the alien feel of the weapon. some created by picking up electromagnetic fields emitted by Xbox consoles.
The common misconception around a lot of sci-fi sound design is that it all has to be synthesized or come from an unnatural place.
You have to ground it a bit, because if you have a sound that just comes from the computer and the software, it could stick out too much.
Put it all together, you get a sound like this.
There are some core sounds that exist that our player base really gravitate towards. These sounds that you just can't change. They will let you know about it, and they will give you feedback. Like the shield recharge sound is one.
Hero sounds included the plasma pistol, which required a very specific type of sound.
We needed a lot of like goopy sounds for our plasma sounds. We were just kind of looking for just very interesting chemical reactions. And we were looking for things that give it a lot of like organic qualities, almost lifelike, almost creature-like in a sense.
What they landed on was heating up these pineapples and watermelons to temperatures of up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which made them explode. Besides the actual firing of the weapons, impact and destruction sounds give the player a second form of sonic feedback for any combat action they've taken in the game. To make the destruction sounds fresh for Infinite, the team not only recorded a range of new explosions, they also got their hands on an old piano, a prop they'd coveted for a while, and proceeded to destroy it, using everything from a hammer to a baseball bat to concrete blocks. They even applied a block of dry ice, a classic part of a sound designer's toolkit, to exposed parts of the piano, which produced this.
Dry ice gives you very alien-like textures because it will just resonate on any type of resonant material you put it on.
The cars the players drive have to sound just as visceral. Halo's vehicle sound design was often grounded in real-world cars, boats, and planes. Like when the team rented out an airport runway to record everything from dune buggies to a Black Hawk helicopter. The team also tracked down this rare, vintage steam-powered tractor and recorded it for the sounds of a futuristic tank in the game, using a machine from 1918 to stand in for one from the 2500s.
If you're recording a tank, it's going to be very hard to get away from the engine sound of the tank, but if you record a vehicle like that steam-powered tractor, you get a lot of the mechanical and metal movement as it travels over things.
Vintage machinery works surprisingly well for sci-fi sounds. For one, it tends to be heavily mechanical, with lots of moving parts. And it's also foreign.
Because it comes from such an old era, people aren't very familiar with it, so it can be kind of sci-fi. We're basically making appropriate sounds from inappropriate objects.
When it's not an antique steam engine, it could be something as mundane as this.
I had to make the sound of some vehicle thrusters as a vehicle moves forward. One morning, I happened to be making a coffee. My coffee maker starts like burbling in the background, and all of a sudden it occurs to me like, oh, that's the sound I need. I can probably work with that.
To fully transport players into the world of Halo, the team had to create detailed ambient sounds for every single environment in the game. And Infinite is the most expansive Halo game yet.
Unlike a film where you would know exactly what footstep someone's going to take and what surface they're going to take that footstep on, you have to account for every surface type in the game, every interaction that a footstep could make with that surface.
Listen to the crunch below a player's foot in the industrial zone versus in the open outdoors.
When you're like designing a soundscape for a map, make it sound like the world is alive, but it's also on an alien planet.
They like to start with something that exists in the real world. No. Kyle and Robbie even spent 2 weeks in Tasmania, recording a huge array of wildlife, including birds, monkeys, Tasmanian devils, and even the rare sounds of tigers mating. Then processing comes in.
You start with something that's like an organic animal sound, and you figure out a way to augment it so that it sounds kind of otherworldly.
Like these goose calls they recorded. And then slowed down by 500% to make them sound significantly more unsettling. Some animal sounds require less manipulation, though, because they're pretty weird to begin with. Like Buddy the Pugs.
And I would just notice these like kind of just really crazy, kind of alien-like sounds coming from him.
After recording the pug noises in the studio, they used them for environmental sounds, like the sounds of these space gophers. The team says that in a future update of the game, the pug sounds will return for something really special. What that is, they can't share just yet. Since there's theoretically no limit to how many times a player might hear these sounds, the sound designers also have to be wary about sound fatigue.
The big thing was being really thoughtful about how much high frequency content we used, being very conservative about our low frequencies so that the mix doesn't become muddy.
They have to balance those concerns with keeping signature Halo sounds alive and sticking to the original concepts that experienced players have grown to know. And while most viewers won't notice if movies reuse sound effects, people spend dozens of hours playing a game like Halo. So Halo's sound team will keep seeking out real-world sounds they can use out of context in the game to create a truly one-of-a-kind soundscape for players.
Some genres, like cartoons, have no actual sound to use as a base, so the sky's the limit for Foley artists to make something from nothing.
Does this sound familiar to you? That's Mr. Krabs walking in SpongeBob.
Can't you just pretend to listen for once in your life?
And notice how quickly he's moving?
It's almost like a dance, you know?
That's typical of cartoon characters, whose exaggerated movements and behavior call for equally exaggerated sound. For Foley artists like Monique or Sana, this is one of the fun challenges of creating sound for animation. And unlike live-action movies, it starts with nothing.
For live action, you have production sound, like what they recorded. So you could kind of like be like, oh, this is what it sounds like. But in animation, it's all up to you. It's like your world to create whatever you want.
Take Gur in Invader Zim, a little robot who's shaped like this.
He looks hollow. So for his body, I use this. And then for his legs, they looked like little cable legs. And these are his little feet. And I always had the kettle next to it, so the metal would kind of resonate and you could kind of hear his body.
Appa, the giant mythical beast in Avatar: The Last Airbender, needed a bigger, rounder sound.
Because he's so big, I had to try different things for him. First, I tried like a couple cushions to do like massive. We tried like big like tree trunks and hit them. We couldn't really get how big and fluffy he is as well. What I did, I got a plunger, I got some paper napkins, filled it up. So you kind of like took the hollowness out of it and got a multiple pieces of duct tape. When I played it, it sounded good. And I tried one that was empty. You could hear the difference.
The duct tape muted the sound, taking away any harshness. So Appa sounds not only big, but also fluffy and round, like the cuddly creature he appears as on screen.
Seem to know everything.
Haha, very funny.
Even if the characters are based on actual real-life animals, the sounds still get wackier in animation, like the sea creatures of SpongeBob.
Krabs has a couple things happening. Think about the crab as a shell. So steps, like the sound of the crab movement.
Doesn't exactly sound like a real crab, does it? That's because real crabs don't move like this. This mile-a-minute pace isn't unique to SpongeBob. Characters in animation generally move faster and more percussively than they do in live action. Keeping up for Foley artists can get exhausting.
That was good.
To emphasize the force behind all these swift, jerky movements, accent sounds take on special importance, especially for fight scenes, like the fast punches Monique did for this scene from the Kung Fu Panda TV show.
Heavenly plum blossom!
Or this popping sound.
Anytime we have a chance to add sound to a scene, we do. Like when they're fighting, anytime when you see those little white lines that go like that, I'll add a whoosh to it. I like using bamboo sticks. You could use antennas or anything that does this kind of sound.
Sana would also accent the character's fight moves with what's called a shing.
I use like a shovel, so that's like a deeper kind of shing. Also, you gotta be careful how to hold the shovel. Like, you can mute it, you could make it more ringy. I've used a machete and a shovel, and then I've used this thing. It's not sharp at all with this. Ooh la la, that was beautiful.
These, as with most Foley sounds, are often combined with sound effects added digitally by sound designers.
So they could get mine manipulated or have theirs. Foley and effects together just really fill it up and make it sound great.
This combination of Foley and digital effects is key, especially because there isn't any production sound to begin with. It's up to the Foley artist to fill this empty playground with sounds, each created individually and often layered together. On SpongeBob, for example, the Foley artists would do something called a water pass.
We would take a big Tupperware tub and fill it up until it was about this much from the top. And we would do a movement. Instead of cloth, we would move water. So we did all of the props dry, because if we made any of the props sound wet, it would be redundant with the water.
But Foley artists aren't afraid to get wet or go over the top, especially when creating sounds for slapstick humor in animated comedy. Sana used an extra wet chamois to amplify the mud splats in Rugrats and capture the spirit of the messy babies. She also used a chamois for the kids' eating sounds, which again had to be exaggerated to match the exaggerated visuals.
So whenever we had Rugrats eating, again, animation, make it bigger than life, you know, over the top. So for that slurping,
Gee, they must be really hungry.
I'm gonna do an element of chamois, and I'm gonna do a bowl, like drinking out of a bowl.
Gee, they must be really hungry.
All kinds of mouth sounds tend to get heightened in animation, like Appa with his gooey tongue lick.
We wanna get something nice and juicy and wet.
And this scene in Teen Titans.
Wider. I need to get both my hands in there. That's one. Wider. There we go.
Okay, she's sticking her hand in his mouth. We're gonna layer the sound of me using my mouth, and then we're gonna layer it with something else that sounds cavernous and open, which is this glove. You know, it sounds like it's got like some depth to it. It's not like shallow.
Now let's see.
So the mouth sounds get wetter. The movements get faster. And even something as mundane as footsteps gets played up for dramatic effect. Nearly every sound gets heightened in animation, which means the creative possibilities for Foley artists are pretty much endless.
Cartoon crabs are one thing, but where do you turn when your main characters are giant metal robots?
The Transformers movies are known for explosions and giant Autobots that crash into buildings. To make all that feel real, the sound has got to be just right. Bumblebee, the latest entry in the franchise, was no exception. To learn more about how the sounds you hear in the movie are made, we talked to the film's Foley team. Foley sounds are any sounds based on a character's interactions and movements. Usually, that means human characters, but it can also apply to the sounds of animals, and in this case, big metallic creatures. Many of Bumblebee's movements aren't different than what you'd expect from a human character, but he's made of metal, so he's going to sound different.
Bumblebee is a car, so it seemed logical that we would use car parts, car doors, car hoods, depending on what part of his body we might be doing.
Surprisingly, the best way to understand what it's like to create sound for an Autobot is with a small, comedic scene. Bumblebee, an adorable alien from outer space, befriends Charlie, played by Haley Steinfeld. There's a hilarious scene in the movie where Bumblebee wrecks Charlie's house.
We sort of thought, yes, Bumblebee's a car, but he's also kind of like a puppy.
He touches things very delicately.
Yeah.
The team had a lot of interesting objects at their disposal, like this very old lawnmower. Riding this over the car door, paired with a little bit of a seat cushion, helped them create the sound of Bumblebee sitting on the couch.
Bumblebee still needs to sound heavy, but you can play with weight and you can play with attack. And sometimes those little things can give a sense of aggression and clumsiness.
They often use these rain birds to get the sounds of Bumblebee's hands. Here, Bumblebee tries to open a soda can. What's more complicated are the multi-part sounds. The individual sounds usually get recorded separately and then layered digitally. For this part of the scene where Bumblebee hits his head on a lamp, they needed to record two sounds. First a helmet hitting a car door, then a lampshade swaying back and forth.
Sometimes something as simple as that lampshade could be 5 tracks easily.
If these two sounds were recorded at once, the sound mixer wouldn't have as much control balancing the two sounds. Surface makes a huge difference.
I put the parts against the car door so that it would sound connected, like it's connected to a whole robot. Otherwise, it might, if I put it on the cement, then it might sound too thin.
For instance, for the sound of Bumblebee tapping his fingers,
I don't know, it just sounds too thin to me.
and for the movie's underwater scene, they actually had to get a little wet. Then, in the editing room, they manipulated the sounds they recorded to reflect how deep underwater Charlie and Bumblebee go. Not every Autobot is the same. Bumblebee and Optimus Prime are very different in size, so they sound different.
My name is Optimus Prime.
Optimus is bigger and more bombastic. Bumblebee is, as the sound team described him, very gentle and almost E.T.-like. You can see that especially in a moment where Bumblebee plays with Charlie's hair. But what about those fight scenes the franchise is known for? Anna Belmer, one of the movie's re-recording mixers, explained how sound works in a fight scene between two Autobots.
The fights are always so challenging. You know, they're two metal robots, but they have to have their own characters. You have to know which one is which. So their punches sound a little different from one to the other. And when one is winning and one is not, obviously whoever's winning's punches we always make stronger than who's losing. You just make them audibly louder and more intense and heavier.
Belmer said they have to be really careful with sound levels in these scenes. Smacking metal sounds much louder than smacking flesh. Too loud and they risk fatiguing the audience. Besides the Autobot fights, another thing this franchise is known for, explosions. Those sounds aren't done with Foley, but digitally. Every explosion sound has to be unique.
The challenge is not to make it sound like every other explosion. So there's an integration that happens with other sounds that you would never think would belong in an explosion. Like maybe a high-end screech that would make you feel uncomfortable, or maybe sometimes even a deep animal vocal, like a deep growl or something to that effect.
Foley is a team effort. It's like being in a band. But hopefully you're working with people that you get along with and that you have the same creative sensibilities like we do, so we're very lucky. Don't try this at home, kids. It's very dangerous. High stakes.
Oh, that's cold.
Typically, Foley artists try to make the most realistic sounds for a scene. But when it comes to game shows, it's usually best to go over the top. That sound isn't really the sound of a cockroach being chewed. It's actually something much more familiar, the sound of crunching M&Ms. You'd think the sounds in a reality show like Fear Factor would be, well, real. But they're created by Foley artists like Monique Raymond. Monique has worked on her fair share of reality competition shows, each of which has its own array of sounds, ranging from outrageous to subtle. But the real challenge is creating the perfect balance between realism and exaggeration.
How'd that sound?
Reality game shows use Foley artists to create their sound effects because it is often too complicated to record high-quality sound while filming those shows. And by using Foley, these artists can add dramatics to the show. There are some instances, like with Wipeout, when exaggeration is actually the whole point.
We would, for each show, do every punching glove and every impact. And the thing is, something like that with production sound, there's probably no impact at all. The glove just probably comes out and the person falls off into the water. In order to make that a more entertaining journey for people to experience visually, we would add a little bit of smack to make it seem more funny and more dramatic and more interesting for people.
To create that extra smack, Monique adds leafy greens on top of the foam mat, creating an extra little crunch to each hit. However, some reality game shows require Foley that is a bit more realistic, like American Gladiators. The foam mat hits aren't embellished with any extra crunch, and the clinking of metal harnesses adds some reality. But in shows like Fear Factor, the fine balance between reality and dramatization really comes into play.
It's almost as if like when you're in a situation where you're nervous and you can almost hear your heartbeat, you don't really hear your heartbeat, but you feel it, right? Well, so that's what we try to do with the Foley with these kinds of shows.
Creepy bugs are a mainstay for Fear Factor. So Monique had to figure out how to create an array of squeamish bug noises. Unlike crunchy cockroaches, a bowl full of worms is created by using an old car chamois.
So we soak them in a tub of water. This is where the magic happens, because they get really soft, and once these guys get soft, they can take on a life of so many different handy things, and this is going to be perfect for worms. So for when we do the worms just kind of gushing, we're going to add a little bit of moisture to make them sound even grosser. Oh yeah, that's nice.
And even the same type of bug can make different sounds depending on the situation. Creating Foley for a tub full of cockroaches is completely different from crunching a cockroach.
Sometimes you nail sounds immediately. Other times you just have to work with it. And with the aquarium full of roaches, a roach has kind of a firm exoskeletal situation. Like, what would sound like those shells? What we came up with rather quickly was like pistachios, but then that didn't really work. The pistachios sounded too small and almost too even, and so then we added Brazil nuts, then we added peanuts, and that wasn't even quite it. And then you think about it, and what is the most creepy part of being surrounded with bugs is having them crawl on you. So we were missing the creepiness of the crawling. And so then we experimented on a little pine cone so that we could get that feeling of being crawled upon, like these things are under your clothes.
While Monique had figured out the noises for the cockroaches, something still didn't sound totally accurate when the cockroaches were initially poured into the tub with a contestant. So she had to adapt her Foley once again to make sure that it sounded just right.
Since there's somebody in there, if I just were to pour this into the plastic tub, it wouldn't sound like there was a body in there. So I added some gloves in here. And if that's not quite enough, I might stick a leather jacket into it.
Monique says that creating the realistic balance of these sounds for Fear Factor was especially difficult because sometimes she had no reference for what a noise sounded like.
There was a specific episode of Fear Factor where somebody had to eat sheep eyes versus buffalo testicles. I don't know what either sound would be, fortunately, but I don't know, if we were just to bite into something that was soft and gushy, that would probably be what it sounded like. But to exaggerate it, to make it a little bit more horrific, we decided to use cherry tomatoes because there was that little popping, there was that skin on the outside, and there's that little explosion of the tomato. We wanted this to sound a little bit more upsetting. And Foley grounds this in reality for people, because if it was all music and score, that might drive the drama of the situation, the suspense of the situation, but it's not going to creep you out.
Now, game shows aren't the only thing she's worked on, but Monique has kind of developed a reputation as one of Hollywood's go-to Foley artists for reality competitions.
I worked on Mad Men for a few seasons. What a beautifully written, acted, stylized show. Now, for Foley, briefcase, hat, glass of scotch, tinkle some ice, all fine and well, but there is no opportunity for imagining what a maggot would sound like.
Nature documentaries also require exaggerated sounds, since you normally wouldn't be able to hear something like a flower growing.
Ah, the northern lights. Beautiful to see and hear. The thing is, the northern lights don't actually make a sound. Yet when you watch this clip, you don't think twice about it. In fact, if you start to really look and listen closely to everything from planet Earth to our planet, you'll notice sounds that would either be impossible to capture or ones that are straight up made up. Nature documentaries are full of unnatural sounds, and they're created in post-production by someone like Richard Hinton, whose job as a nature doc Foley artist is a study in the subtle art of exaggeration. So why even create sounds for nature docs? Well, shooting in the wild makes it almost impossible to capture real sound. Take this aerial shot of a dolphin pod in our planet. It was filmed high up in the air by a drone, so while the dolphins are splashing up and down, all the camera picks up are loud blades. Nature docs also frequently utilize macro lenses, meaning they might actually be shooting a subject matter that's across a valley, or they'll capture objects normally too small to have a registered noise to it. That means that sometimes Richard and his team at Films at 59 will actually have to fake sounds to give life to it.
And there's no sound there, obviously, and that can feel a bit strange, or there's a hole in the story.
For the hunt, he needed to get the sound of a spider shooting a web.
I really like doing stuff like this because I get carte blanche to be a little creative. Because there's no Perceivable sound in nature, it means I can kind of make something up.
But while he can make something up, he still needs to match the sound he's watching on screen. For the web, he needed something really stretchy, so he grabbed a slinky and stretched it out as far as possible.
You get that wonderful cable under tension.
Now, it sounded good when he just stretched it out between his hands, like you see here. But because the camera was so close, he needed a really close sound. So he applied proximity effect, where the Foley artist will make a sound as close to the mic as possible. It's actually a risky move.
The microphone is almost feeding back on itself because you're too close to the mic or you're overloading the mic.
But he found the winning noise only by shoving the slinky right on top of the mic.
That proximity just pulls you in really tight to the action and what's going on the screen, and it just makes it sound more unworldly.
He didn't just need the web blast. He also had to capture a spider's tiny footsteps, yet another thing in nature that normally wouldn't have a sound, at least that humans could hear. He needed something more delicate than most animal footsteps. He started playing with a bunch of magnetic audio tape, a classic Foley technique that can cover many types of sounds.
You could use this, but it sounds too clumpy. It's not delicate enough, it's not precise enough. If I wrap it around the reel, I can use the reel as a sounding board. And you can get individual footsteps.
Close-ups also mean he will need to exaggerate parts of a larger animal you wouldn't normally hear a sound from. For example, when working on Disney's Bears, Richard needed to capture the sound of a bear opening its eye and blinking. Because a bear is covered in fur, he first rubbed a piece of fur to capture the lid opening. But Richard actually needed to create two sounds, as he observed that moisture forms when one opens their eyes. For a wetter sound, he relied on his own mouth. It's when these two sounds are mixed together that you really hear the lid opening. The up-close and personal presentation of nature docs is what brings Richard to create some of the most innovative noises. Thanks to amazing HD cameras, time-lapse technology has changed what a nature doc can capture, and we can now witness the entire cycle of a plant growing.
The beauty, from my point of view as a Foley artist, because it is such a stylized shot, I don't have to think too carefully about being true to nature. It gives me a certain level of creative freedom.
Like with the spiderweb, Richard needed a stretchy sound for this shot from Planet Earth 2, where mushrooms and other fungi spring from the ground, but he wanted a sound more organic than a slinky. He first went for a mushy effect with a wet newspaper, but he needed more control. Through this trial and error, he found leather strips and scuba gear were the only things both stretchy and controllable enough. To add a little sweetener, Richard played around with a wet leather chamois.
And this is a particularly useful add to if you're showing the decay of the fungus as well as the growth, because usually they kind of melt into a sticky, kind of wet, moist, oozy kind of substance.
Now, there are certain things in nature docs that you wouldn't hear even if you got up close to it, because they are simply a visual phenomenon. Like the northern lights we mentioned earlier. For some animal movements, there is a real sound, but it's not very pleasant to listen to. So he needs to create something better, like he did for these underwater shots in Our Planet.
You don't really hear much sound underwater, although sound travels very well. It's very... It would become very tiresome to listen to after about 2 minutes. Your ears would get really tired and you'd probably turn off. So we embellish a little bit.
Unsurprisingly, he uses real water, but it's how his hands interact with the water that makes the difference.
The smaller the animal, the more delicate you can be.
When it gets to more medium-sized fish, like this large shoal of mackerel in Our Planet, he'll also dump that clump of magnetic tape into the tank for an extra layer of sound.
What you can do is you can focus on the moving shoal and really focus on those tight turns and those sharp movements.
If there's more than one type of aquatic animal in the shot, Richard will differentiate by doing one take with the magnetic tape and one without. For something larger, like a whale, seen in this shot, he'll both make his movements larger and go deeper into the water. There is always extra editing that goes on after Richard is done recording. Richard will later apply an EQ, which filters out harsher frequency and adds depth, making it at least feel like it is really recorded under the ocean. Listen to this before and after. Lava makes a surprisingly soft sound, and when Richard had to exaggerate it for this scene in Planet Earth 2, he wanted it to have more impact.
You kind of hear the interaction of what it's setting fire to more than the sound of the lava creeping.
Now, just the fire crackling doesn't give much of a sense of the massive scale of a lava flow. He needed a low-end rumble. He uses smaller rocks when making glaciers to capture the debris, but went for a much larger one here.
For this, I put some gloves on because there's real danger of losing a fingernail. It's a very bassy sound.
While Richard has a lot of freedom on nature shows and movies, there's one area he really can't embellish or exaggerate.
There's a lot of science around animal vocalizations these days. There's a whole range of alarm calls and distress calls and greeting calls. So we rely very heavily on accurate library recordings to make sure that we're getting it correct.
But Richard will be brought in for the vocals you might not think about, such as eating, breathing, or panting. For Our Planet, Richard was asked to make a very specific lip-smacking sound from an orangutan, as the actual footage contained crew members talking in the background.
And it gets quite painful if you're doing that for 5 minutes. But, you know, Foley is a contact sport, and we suffer for our art.
Sometimes it's not just what you use to make the sound, but all the subtle nuances of how you use it that can really crank up the suspense.
Listen as Elizabeth Moss turns off the sink in this scene. Now listen to it with a completely different sound design. In the first version, all sound cuts out. But that's a whole lot scarier. Sound has been an important element in film for a long time. But in horror movies, it plays an even bigger role.
When it comes to like horror films, you don't want to give away the ghost. You don't want to give away the monster or the moment.
That's Leslie Bloom, co-founder of Alchemy Post Sound. And he just described the key difference between regular Foley sound and what he does as a Foley artist for horror movies like The Invisible Man. Normally, Foley focuses on sounds made by characters you see. But in horror, it's about the sounds of the unseen character, someone or something that may be there, without the audience knowing for sure that it is. That's what ratchets up the suspense and primes the audience for a truly terrifying reveal. And maybe no film does this better than the one with an invisible villain. Take the simple sound of wind, a staple of horror movie sound design, whether it's curtains reacting to a rush of air or a flock of birds flapping against the breeze. In a regular movie, you might hear wind when characters open a window or walk outside. But in horror movies, often the source of the sound won't be clear. For this next part, you might want to grab your headphones. This scene signals the Invisible Man's presence with mysterious whooshing sounds, created by flapping an old shirt. You can't actually see where this wind sound is coming from, but as Elizabeth Moss's character Cecilia approaches the sink, the whooshes build in intensity. And build until each one sounds more like a rumble. Still, the window's closed and the curtains look pretty still, so the sound suggests something's moving inside the room. Exactly where, we don't know. There's another sound in the scene that confuses our senses even more. Hear those wind chimes? They're subtle but disorienting, especially because the sound isn't coming from something you can point to in the outside world. See, Leslie uses different kinds of wind chimes to accentuate tense moments in horror scenes, even if there aren't any chimes in the shot.
It could be that moment that, somebody hears a ringing in their ears.
That ringing in the ears is called a subjective sound, something the character's hearing in their mind. In horror movies, subjective sound helps place you inside the protagonist's head, so you identify with their fear.
Then we have the one that was actually used in the Invisible Man.
It's how the Foley artist handles the chimes that makes the sound creepy. This is what Leslie calls a demented wind chime, a sound Alchemy made for The Night House. They created it by putting an old telephone bell on a rope and swinging it around. The slower you swing it, the creepier it gets. Even the most common sounds require special treatment in horror movies, like footsteps. Alchemy has a huge shoe collection for this purpose.
I know how each one of these shoes reacts to every one of these floor surfaces.
In a non-horror movie, you'll likely know exactly where footstep sounds are coming from and how close they are to the central character. But in horror movies, sometimes the most effective footsteps are barely audible, so you really have to strain to hear them, just as the protagonist is doing. To soften the footsteps of the Invisible Man and match the sound of his neoprene suit, Leslie walked around with rubber gloves over his feet, adding a yoga mat to mute the sounds even more. The result? You might not even be sure you heard anything at all. That uncertainty is the bread and butter of suspense in horror movies. Barely perceptible sounds can make you doubt your own senses, just like the character is doubting theirs, and that makes the viewing experience that much scarier. What places you even further into the protagonist's shoes, literally, is the sound of their footsteps.
She is like nervously shaking. I'm going to try to portray that in her movements, in her footsteps.
To play this up, the artists at Alchemy don't use just any regular floor.
I need old crappy wood, I need a really bad subfloor, and I need really crappy nails that are going to move within the wood.
Leslie made a custom one that met all those requirements, partly using 65-year-old wood. Each corner makes slightly different kinds of creaky sounds, which emphasize the sense of unsteadiness. Like you're, again, literally on shaky ground. To cap it all off, there's this, the accent sound. That's a sharp, pronounced sound that stands out against the subtler, more ambient ones we've been hearing, indicating to the audience that something is off. Leslie used an old sink to create this unsettling squeak. But that came out sounding like too big a piece of metal, so he used a towel to dampen the sound. But what really makes this scarier than this is the way everything else goes quiet after the sink squeaks. It's not realistic for all the sounds to suddenly stop right when the faucet does. But sound in horror movies isn't always about realism. Often, it's about creating a heightened reality.
It doesn't have to be wall-to-wall sound all the time. Having that brief moment of just silence and then wham, to me that's powerful.
Here, the few moments of absolute quiet put the audience on edge right before the moment of attack. And when that moment does come, the contrast is that much stronger.
I like to make this grab just a little bit larger than life. Let's get a grab on more skin. We'll layer the two of those together. And I want to throw in like a little bit of creak just when she's getting lifted up. That's a hit and a grab and the whole 9 yards, so, you know, she's in trouble.
Now let's watch another scene and see how these suspense sounds play out together. The accent sound comes earlier in this scene, in the form of a jarring phone ring. The phone has an unnaturally loud echo against the wood. And it's startling because of its contrast with the otherwise quiet attic. But that's sort of a fake out, because afterwards we return to quiet, which can give the audience a sense of false calm. Cecilia's shaky, creaky footsteps are actually crawling sounds in this scene, which put the viewer right there with her as she moves across the attic. Leslie accentuated the sound of the creaking floorboards using his custom-made creak box. Earlier, we saw how subtle footsteps and whooshes signaled the bad guy's presence. Here, it's the faint rattle of a ladder in the distance.
She hears something, and it jars her. Now, we don't need climbing up the ladder because that would be just giving away the farm. Not too loud, not too big. He's trying to sneak up on her, too.
Since all we hear is that rattle, we don't know exactly where the bad guy is, throwing our senses off yet again. That's crucial because it's priming us for this jump scare. Part of why that reveal is so terrifying is because of the proximity of the Invisible Man. By giving us minimal hints as to his whereabouts, the sound design tricked us into thinking he was farther away.
When he gets splashed with paint, at that point, the cat's out of the bag.
The big moment here called for some bigger and messier sounds.
We don't want to dump paint everywhere, but we need it to sound thick and gooey.
The best tool for that are these scraps of sheepskin, which Leslie says are nastier than your usual towel or rag.
But it holds a ton of water in it, which gives it a very, very gooey, visceral kind of sound to it.
To maximize moments like this, horror movies have to walk a fine line, figuring out how to hide a character while revealing them at the same time. They accomplish this with subtle Foley and sound design that goes beyond realism to create a heightened reality, where your ears and mind are playing tricks on you.
Don't let him haunt you.
Hello?